The marquee still hangs, faded letters missing from decades of neglect. Grand Theater, it once proclaimed to the main street of Millfield, Ohio, population 4,328 and falling. Behind locked doors, dust covers seats that haven't held moviegoers since 2004. Projection equipment sits silent in a room where teenagers once threaded film reels under flickering lights. This is the story of how America's small-town movie theaters, once the pride of Main streets from Maine to California, disappeared like spirits into the night, leaving only empty buildings and memories. What killed the small-town movie theater? Was it the multiplexes that rose along interstate exits, the streaming services that put blockbusters in living rooms, or was it something deeper, a fundamental shift in how Americans relate to their communities and to each other? The answer, it seems, depends on who you ask. In Millfield, Edward Kelly remembers. At 83, he walks past the Grand Theater each morning on his way to the diner, glancing up at the marquee, where he once paid 35 cents to see Rebel Without a Cause. Sometimes he swears he can still smell the popcorn. My first date with Martha was at the Grand, he says, pausing on the sidewalk. August 1957, an affair to remember with Cary Grant, paid for her ticket and bought her a Coca-Cola. Married her 11 months later. The Grand Theater opened in 1921, during the silent film era, when movies were still a novelty and theaters were palaces. It seated 412 people, nearly a tenth of Millfield's population. On Saturday nights, farmers drove into town in pickup trucks, parking along Main Street. Parents dropped off children for the matinee, knowing neighbors would keep watch. First dates happened in those dark rows, and so did marriage proposals, teenage rebellions, and moments of collective joy when the hometown team won state championships and the celebration spilled into the theater for an impromptu screening. The Grand wasn't unique. In 1950, America had over 20,000 movie theaters, the vast majority single-screen venues in towns with populations under 15,000. These weren't just places to watch films, they were community anchors, as essential to small-town identity as churches and high schools. A town without a theater was considered incomplete, lacking a certain legitimacy. Bethany Norris stands in what was once the concession stand of the Majestic Theater in Riverdale, Michigan. She's 72 now, but in 1965, she was a 16-year-old selling popcorn and milk duds to her classmates. Working at the theater was the best job in town for a teenager, she says, running her hand along a counter now covered with architectural blueprints. The Majestic is being converted into luxury apartments. Everyone wanted to work here. You got to see the movies for free, and you knew everyone who came through the door. I still remember exactly how to make the perfect popcorn, just the right amount of salt and butter flavoring. The Majestic opened in 1926, built by Bethany's grandfather, Joseph Norris, who believed every proper town needed a movie house. The Spanish Revival-style building, with its ornate ceiling and red velvet curtains, cost $42,000 to build, an astronomical sum for the time. It had 375 seats, a small stage for live performances before the main feature, and a Wurlitzer organ for silent films. Later, a projection system for talkies was installed at great expense. Joseph Norris wasn't unusual. Across America, local entrepreneurs invested their life savings in movie theaters, seeing them not just as businesses but as civic contributions. In Grangeville, Idaho, the Blue Fox Theater was built by a consortium of local businessmen. In Aberdeen, Mississippi, the Elkin Theater was funded by the owner of the town hardware store. In Ely, Nevada, the Central Theater was built by a former miner who struck it rich. These theaters became physical manifestations of community pride. Their architecture was often elaborate, even in the smallest towns. Marquees glowed with neon, lobbies featured Art Deco flourishes, and auditoriums had ceiling murals depicting classical scenes. The projection room, that mysterious space where the magic happened, was off-limits to all but a select few, creating an air of mystery that added to the theatrical experience. By the 1940s, movie theaters had become essential to the American social fabric. Weekly attendance peaked in 1946, when an estimated 90 million Americans, out of a population of 141 million, went to the movies at least once a week. World War II newsreels brought the front lines to hometowns. Children spent Saturday mornings watching serials and cartoons while their parents shopped downtown. Teenagers found rare freedom in the darkened rows. You've got to understand what these places meant, says film historian Richard Hollander. This was before television was in every home. Movies were how America saw itself, how small towns connected to the larger culture. The theater owner knew everyone in town, extended credit during hard times, and was often involved in local politics and civic organizations. In Millfield, the Grand Theater was owned by the Peterson family for 3 generations. Harold Peterson, who took over from his father in 1954, was also the president of the Chamber of Commerce and the High School Booster Club. He knew which farmers were struggling and would sometimes slip their children free tickets. During the blizzard of 1966, when power was out across town for 4 days, he opened the theater as a warming station, showing free movies using the theater's generator. But even as small-town theaters thrived culturally, economic challenges were emerging. The 1948 Supreme Court decision in United States v. Paramount Pictures, Inc. forced movie studios to divest themselves of their theater chains. While this ended certain monopolistic practices, it also removed a financial safety net for many theaters. Suddenly, small-town exhibitors had to negotiate directly with distributors, often at significant disadvantage. The real existential threat, however, arrived in America's living rooms. Television ownership exploded from 6,000 sets in 1946 to 12 million by 1951. By 1955, half of all American homes had a television. Studios responded with innovations like Cinerama, CinemaScope, and 3D, gimmicks designed to offer experiences television couldn't match. Some say the Grand Theater in Millfield was cursed from the start. Local legend claims it was built on land where a traveling medicine show performer died under mysterious circumstances in 1887. Old-timers recall strange cold spots in the theater, even during summer heat waves. Night watchmen reported hearing phantom applause when the building was empty, and some swore they saw shadows moving across the projection screen when no film was playing. My father wouldn't talk about it much, says Edward Kelly, but he told me once that the film would sometimes start playing backwards for no reason. Projector working fine, but the images going in reverse. He'd check the machine and find nothing wrong. These stories grew more elaborate as the theater aged. When the Grand closed briefly in 1964 for renovations, workers reported finding strange symbols carved into the baseboards behind the screen. During the theater's final years, the last owner claimed the marquee letters would rearrange themselves overnight, spelling cryptic messages. Whether these tales represent actual paranormal phenomena, collective imagination, or simply the human tendency to mythologize beloved institutions remains debated. The 1950s and 1960s brought subtler but more profound changes to the small-town theater ecosystem. The suburbs expanded, drawing population and commerce away from downtown areas. Shopping centers and strip malls appeared along highways, shifting retail patterns. Drive-in theaters, numbering 4,063 at their peak in 1958, offered an alternative movie experience that matched America's growing car culture. Millfield's Grand Theater adapted, installing a wider screen and stereophonic sound in 1955 at a cost of $23,700. Harold Peterson raised ticket prices from 35 to 50 cents for adults. The concession stand expanded its offerings, adding box candy and fountain drinks where profit margins were higher. For a while, these changes worked. The theater remained profitable through the 1960s, though margins grew thinner. Dad was always worried about paying the bills, recalls Thomas Peterson, Harold's son. He'd sit at the kitchen table at night, working the numbers, but he never considered closing. The theater wasn't just our livelihood, it was our contribution to the town. In Riverdale, the Majestic followed a similar path. Joseph Norris's son, William, took over operations in 1952. He installed air conditioning in 1957, a substantial investment at $15,800, but one that filled seats during Michigan's humid summers. William extended the concession stand and added a cry room where parents with fussy babies could watch the film without disturbing others. He started a dish night promotion, where women received free dinnerware with their ticket purchase. The theaters of this era existed in symbiotic relationship with their towns. When the Reynolds manufacturing plant in Riverdale had a good year, attendance at the Majestic rose. When drought hit Millfield's farms in 1963, the Grand's receipts fell. Theater owners extended credit, knowing their fortunes were tied to the community's welfare. My grandfather knew every farmer's situation, says Bethany Norris. If crops were bad, he'd tell them to pay when they could. Sometimes they'd bring vegetables or eggs instead of money. It wasn't just business, it was neighbors helping neighbors. This interconnectedness extended to programming. Theater owners knew their audiences intimately and selected films accordingly. The Grand avoided R-rated horror films because Harold Peterson knew they wouldn't play well with Millfield's conservative families. The Majestic ran longer engagements of Disney films because Riverdale had many young families. During harvest season, both theaters started their evening shows later, allowing farmers time to finish their day's work. But by the 1970s, the economic models that had sustained small-town theaters for decades were breaking down. Television continued expanding its reach with more channels and improved programming. The Motion Picture Association of America introduced its rating system in 1968, leading to more adult-oriented content that sometimes alienated conservative small-town audiences. Studios began demanding higher percentages of ticket sales, especially for blockbusters, squeezing exhibitors' already thin margins. The most visible threat, however, came in the form of multiplexes. The first true multiplex, the Parkway Twin, opened in Kansas City in 1963 with 2 screens. By 1970, 4-screen theaters were appearing in suburban shopping centers. The AMC Grand 24 in Dallas, which opened in 1995, featured 24 screens and amenities small-town theaters couldn't match. These multiplexes fundamentally changed the economics of exhibition. With multiple screens, they could show different films simultaneously, catering to various audience segments and maximizing attendance. Their larger concession stands offered more profitable food options. Their locations near shopping malls and highway exits drew from wider geographic areas. For Millfield's Grand Theater, the death knell came in 1982, when Starcrest Cinemas opened a 6-screen multiplex in a shopping center 12 miles away, just off Interstate 70. The new theater had Dolby sound, cup holders in the armrests, and a video game arcade in the lobby. Within 3 months, the Grand's attendance had fallen by 40%. Harold Peterson tried to compete. He refurbished the Grand's seats, upgraded the sound system, and expanded the concession offerings. For a while, loyalty kept some Millfield residents coming to the Grand, but the convenience and selection of the multiplex eventually proved too attractive. By 1985, the Grand was operating at a loss. Harold died that winter, and his son Thomas took over. I tried everything, Thomas says. Discount nights, double features, renting the space for community events, but the numbers just didn't work anymore. We were getting the films weeks after the multiplex, when everyone had already seen them. The distributors treated us like we were insignificant. The Grand limped along until 1992, when Thomas finally locked the doors for what he thought would be the last time. The theater sat empty for 2 years until a church group purchased it for $68,000, less than half its assessed value, and converted it into a worship space. The sloped floor was leveled, the projection equipment removed, and the marquee repurposed to display Bible verses. The church lasted until 2001, when declining membership forced it to close. The building has remained empty since, falling into disrepair. In Riverdale, the Majestic followed a different path. William Norris died in 1974, and his daughter Catherine took over operations. Recognizing the threat from multiplexes, she made a bold decision, splitting the single auditorium into 2 smaller theaters. The $87,000 renovation, completed in 1976, allowed the renamed Majestic Twin to show 2 films simultaneously while preserving much of the original architecture. The gamble worked, at least temporarily. The Majestic Twin remained profitable through the early 1980s, benefiting from Riverdale's relative isolation and strong community support. Catherine began experimenting with alternative content, foreign films on Wednesdays, classics on Sunday afternoons, live music performances on select weekends. The theater became known regionally for its eclectic programming and preserved Art Deco interior. Catherine's daughter Bethany joined the family business in 1978 after attending college. She brought fresh ideas, including midnight showings of the Rocky Horror Picture Show, which drew audiences from neighboring counties. She started a film festival highlighting Michigan filmmakers and converted unused office space into a small art gallery featuring local artists. We knew we couldn't compete with the multiplexes on their terms, Bethany recalls. So we created an experience they couldn't offer, something more personal, more connected to the community's identity. This approach sustained the Majestic through the 1980s and into the early 1990s. But larger forces were reshaping the exhibition landscape. The rise of home video, first VHS, then DVD, gave consumers unprecedented control over their viewing. Cable television expanded dramatically, offering dozens of channels with movies and original programming. In 1997, Netflix launched its DVD by mail service, beginning the long disruption of traditional movie distribution. For small-town theaters across America, these changes proved devastating. Between 1980 and 2000, approximately 5,000 single-screen theaters closed. Towns that had supported movie houses for generations suddenly found themselves without this cultural anchor. Downtown areas, already struggling from retail migration to malls and big-box stores, suffered another blow as theater traffic disappeared. The Majestic Twin closed in 1998, a victim not of poor management, but of shifting technologies and consumer habits. Catherine Norris, then 76, couldn't justify the $250,000 investment needed to upgrade to digital projection and sound. The building remained in the family's possession but sat unused until 2015, when a developer purchased it for conversion to apartments. "I still have the original blueprints," Bethany says, "and the projectors. I couldn't bear to sell them. They're in my garage, covered with tarps. Sometimes I go look at them and remember the sound they made, that distinctive clickety-clack as the film ran through." The stories of the Grand and the Majestic reflect broader patterns in America's small-town theaters. Some closed entirely, some were repurposed as churches, community centers, or retail spaces. Some were demolished to make way for parking lots or new development. A fortunate few were preserved by nonprofit organizations or municipal governments as historical landmarks. In Millfield, the Grand Theater sits in a kind of limbo. The building is structurally sound but deteriorating. The current owner, an out-of-state real estate investment group that acquired it in a portfolio of foreclosed properties, has no clear plans for the space. The marquee, with its missing letters, has become a symbol of downtown decline. Edward Kelly passes it each morning on his walk, sometimes pausing to peer through the dusty windows. In the lobby, film posters from the 1980s still hang in their frames, colors faded by decades of sunlight. The concession stand counter remains, though the equipment is long gone. Occasionally, when the light hits just right, he can see all the way to the screen, now torn and stained. "Something important disappeared when we lost the Grand," he says. "It wasn't just a place to see movies. It was where the town came together. Now everyone stays home, watching whatever they want on their own screens. It's more convenient, I suppose, but we lost something in the bargain." Some Millfield residents report strange phenomena around the abandoned theater. Motion-sensitive security cameras installed in 2010 frequently triggered between 2 and 3 a.m., though no intruders were ever found. Passersby claimed to hear muffled music or applause coming from inside the empty building. In 2017, a group of teenagers who broke in to explore reported seeing a shadowy figure in the projection booth, though nothing was visible in the photos they took. "I don't believe in ghosts," says Millfield Police Chief Gerald Thompson, "but I've had 3 different officers tell me they've seen lights moving inside that building when it was supposed to be empty. Could be electrical issues, could be trespassers we never caught, or maybe old Harold Peterson is still running the place from beyond, who knows." The phenomenon of phantom theaters appears in small towns across America, where closed movie houses become focal points for local legends and supernatural claims. In Elkhart, Indiana, the Lerner Theater reportedly manifests the smell of popcorn at precisely 7:30 p.m., though the concession equipment was removed decades ago. In Tyler, Texas, the Liberty Theater's marquee lights occasionally illuminate at midnight despite being disconnected from power sources. In Durango, Colorado, the Gaslight Theater reportedly plays host to the spirit of a projectionist who died in the booth in 1962. Whether these stories represent actual paranormal activity, collective nostalgia, or simple urban legends remains debated. What's clear, however, is that closed theaters often retain powerful emotional resonance in their communities, physical reminders of a shared cultural experience now vanished. The technological shifts that began with television and home video accelerated dramatically in the early 21st century. The transition from film to digital projection, which began in earnest around 2010, required substantial investment, typically $50,000 to $100,000 per screen. While major chains could absorb these costs, many independent theaters couldn't. By 2013, distributors had largely stopped providing 35 film prints, forcing theaters to convert or close. For some small-town theaters, digital conversion became a community cause. In Webster City, Iowa, residents raised $120,000 to save the Webster Theater. In Spencer, Indiana, the Tivoli Theater was purchased by the local Preservation Society and renovated with grant funding. The Lyric Theater in Blacksburg, Virginia, transitioned to a nonprofit model with membership subscriptions supporting operations. These success stories, however, represent the exception rather than the rule. For every theater saved by community action, dozens disappeared quietly, their closures marked only by darkened marquees and newspaper obituaries. The COVID-19 pandemic of 2022-021, which forced prolonged closures and accelerated the shift to streaming platforms, delivered what may prove the final blow to many struggling small-town theaters. Yet even as traditional exhibition falters, new models emerge. In Whitesburg, Kentucky, the Appleshop Community Media Center operates a theater showcasing regional filmmakers. The Belcourt Theater in Nashville functions as a nonprofit film center with educational programs. The Texas Theater in Dallas, infamous as the place where Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested, now operates as a repertory cinema and cultural space. Some communities have embraced outdoor screenings, returning to cinema's carnival roots. The Drive-Away Movies program in rural Vermont brings inflatable screens to underserved communities. In Marfa, Texas, the Marfa Film Festival projects movies onto the side of historic buildings. These alternatives can't replace the everyday presence of a permanent theater, but they maintain some connection to collective viewing. What has been lost with the disappearance of small-town theaters goes beyond convenient entertainment access. These institutions served as democratic spaces where community members from different backgrounds gathered in shared experience. They provided cultural touchstones that connected rural and small-town America to broader cultural currents. Their weekly programming created common reference points for local conversation. The theater was where I learned about the wider world, says Edward Kelly of Millfield. I saw Paris and New York in the Wild West, all from my seat at the Grand. It's how I knew there was something beyond our little town. The economic impacts extend beyond the lost jobs and vacant buildings. Traditional movie theaters anchored downtown areas, generating foot traffic that benefited neighboring businesses. Evening showtimes brought people downtown after business hours, supporting restaurants and creating a sense of safety through activity. The theater's marquee provided both literal and figurative illumination to Main Street. In Riverdale, the conversion of the Majestic to apartments represents a common fate for historic theaters, adaptive reuse that preserves the building while fundamentally changing its function. The exterior remains largely intact, including the restored marquee, now advertising the Majestic luxury apartments. Inside, the sloped floor has been leveled, the balcony converted to additional units, the lobby transformed into a resident lounge. Only the decorative ceiling medallions and wall sconces hint at the building's theatrical past. Bethany Norris has mixed feelings about the conversion. At least it's still standing, she says. So many theaters get demolished. But it's strange to think of people living their private lives where hundreds once gathered to share an experience. These apartments start at $1,200 a month. Most people in Riverdale can't afford that. The gentrification of historic theaters represents another layer of loss, the transformation of democratic cultural spaces into exclusive private property. In communities across America, theaters that once welcomed anyone with the price of admission now house luxury condominiums, high-end retail, or corporate offices. The architectural shells remain, but their function as public gathering places has vanished. Some theaters suffer a more ignominious fate. The Rex Theater in Gallipolis, Ohio, became a storage facility. The Princess Theater in Bloomington, Illinois, housed a pawnshop before being abandoned entirely. In Hastings, Nebraska, the Rivoli Theater became a parking garage, its ornate facade demolished to accommodate vehicle access. Even theaters that maintain their original function often bear little resemblance to their historical predecessors. The conversion of single-screen theaters to multiplexes frequently destroys architectural features and eliminates the shared viewing experience that defined traditional exhibition. Where audiences once gathered in a single auditorium, they now disperse among multiple smaller screening rooms, reducing the sense of collective engagement. The cultural implications of this shift extend beyond nostalgia. Film theorists and sociologists have long noted the unique quality of theatrical viewing, the communal experience of emotional response, the forced attention in a darkened room, the democratic mingling of diverse audience members. As viewing migrates to individual screens in private spaces, these aspects of cinema culture diminish. There's something fundamentally different about watching a comedy in a theater full of laughing people versus watching alone on your laptop, says film scholar Marcus Reed. Studies show we laugh more readily in groups, cry more easily when others around us are emotional. The theatrical experience shapes our reception of the content in ways streaming can't replicate. For small towns, the loss of movie theaters often coincides with broader economic and cultural shifts. As manufacturing declines, young people depart, and retail consolidates in regional centers, the movie theater's disappearance becomes both symptom and cause of community contraction. Without cultural amenities, attracting new residents and businesses becomes more difficult, accelerating decline. In Millfield, the closing of the Grand Theater in 1992 preceded a cascade of downtown departures. The hardware store closed in 1997, the family restaurant in 2001, the pharmacy in 2006. Today, Main Street features more vacant storefronts than operating businesses. The population has fallen from 5,214 in 1990 to 4,328 today, with further decline projected. You can't say the theater closing caused all that, says Mayor Frank Williams. But it was an important domino. Once the Grand went dark, people had one less reason to come downtown. The Saturday night crowd disappeared, and the restaurants felt it first. Similar stories play out across rural and small-town America, where theater closures often presage broader community contractions. The loss isn't just economic but psychological, a diminishment of civic identity and cultural possibility. Towns without theaters may struggle to perceive themselves as full communities, particularly as other institutions like local newspapers also disappear. Yet even as traditional exhibition declines, the human desire for shared cultural experience remains. New models emerge, adapted to contemporary economics and technologies. The microcinema movement creates intimate viewing spaces with curated programming. Community film clubs organize screenings in repurposed spaces. Pop-up cinemas temporarily transform parks, warehouses, and vacant lots into theaters. In some communities, the very nostalgia that surrounds lost theaters becomes a catalyst for renewal. The Egyptian Theater in DeKalb, Illinois, operates as a nonprofit venue for film and live events, supported by community donations and grants. The Tampa Theater in Florida survives as a film and cultural center, its atmospheric interior preserved through a foundation. The Michigan Theater in Ann Arbor transitioned from commercial operation to community ownership, now functioning as a film and performance space. These success stories share common elements: community ownership or nonprofit status, diversified programming beyond first-run films, and emotional investment from local stakeholders. They suggest that while the commercial single-screen theater may be economically unsustainable in most small towns, the cultural function these institutions served can survive in adapted forms. In Millfield, a group of residents formed the Grand Restoration Project in 2015, hoping to purchase the theater and revive it as a community arts center. They've raised $87,000 toward their $350,000 goal, enough for a structural assessment, but far short of the full renovation cost. The current owner has expressed willingness to sell, but won't reduce the asking price of $275,000, despite the building's deterioration. "We're not giving up," says project leader Sarah Jameson. "This building means too much to our town. We're applying for historic preservation grants, organizing fundraisers. It won't be just a movie theater if we succeed. It'll be a performance space, a classroom for kids' programs, a meeting place. But films will always be part of what we do." The Grand Restoration Project represents a common pattern in small-town theater preservation, grassroots efforts fighting economic headwinds, balancing nostalgia with practical adaptation. These campaigns often stretch over years or decades, sometimes succeeding through persistence, sometimes failing despite valiant efforts. In Riverdale, though the Majestic now houses apartments, its cinematic legacy continues in unexpected ways. Bethany Norris established the Majestic film series, which screens movies monthly in the high school auditorium. The programs mix classics, independent films, and occasional new releases, drawing audiences from across the county. A nonprofit organization, it operates with volunteer support and grants from local businesses. It's not the same as having our own theater, Bethany acknowledges, but we're keeping something alive, the idea that watching movies together matters, that it's different from everyone streaming separately at home. The story of small-town movie theaters remains unfinished. While thousands have disappeared, hundreds survive in various forms. Some operate commercially, finding sustainable niches through specialized programming or tourist appeal. Others continue through nonprofit or municipal support, their cultural value recognized beyond pure market calculations. Still others exist in memory and aspiration, their buildings awaiting possible revival or repurposing. What happened to America's small-town movie theaters? The answer varies by community and perspective. Economic forces, corporate consolidation, technological change, shifting consumer preferences certainly played central roles. But cultural factors proved equally significant. Suburbanization, the atomization of entertainment, the privatization of formerly public experiences. Some observers see the theater's decline as inevitable creative destruction, the natural evolution of media technology and distribution. Others view it as a preventable loss, a consequence of policy choices that prioritized corporate scale over community institutions. Still others frame it in supernatural terms, the theater as a haunted space, its disappearance part of broader spiritual malaise. Perhaps all these interpretations contain elements of truth. Perhaps none fully captures the complex interplay of factors that transformed America's cinematic landscape over 7 decades. The small-town movie theater's disappearance represents not a single story, but thousands of individual narratives, each with its own characters, circumstances, and unresolved mysteries. In Millfield, Edward Kelly still walks past the Grand Theater each morning. Sometimes he pauses, looking up at the marquee, where he first asked Martha to share his popcorn. Sometimes he continues without breaking stride. But he always knows it's there, a shadow of its former self, yet somehow still present in the town's consciousness. They say the Grand is haunted, he remarks. Maybe it is. But I think what haunts it isn't some ghost, it's all our memories, all the moments we shared in those seats. First kisses, first dates, nights when the whole town cheered together or cried together. That doesn't just disappear, even when the building empties out. It lingers, like the smell of popcorn after everyone's gone home. As twilight falls on Main Street, shadows lengthen across the Grand's faded facade. Behind darkened windows, dust continues its slow accumulation on seats where generations once gathered. The projection booth remains silent, its equipment long gone. But in the right light, at the right moment, one might imagine the flicker of phantom images across the tattered screen, echoes of a shared experience that once defined American community life, now faded but not entirely forgotten. So whatever happened to small-town movie theaters? Ask 10 people, get 10 answers. Economic forces, technological change, cultural shifts, corporate consolidation, all played their parts. But perhaps the truest explanation lies in that space between explanation and mystery, where the rational and the emotional converge. Like the theaters themselves, the answer exists somewhere between what we can prove and what we choose to believe.